Welcome everybody to another week of Available Work. I'm Joe Esparza. This is our Texas Workforce Development Podcast, made for employers, made from our training partners, and anybody that's looking to work. We want to give you another week of Available Work, and our goal is to help employers learn about the resources they need to recruit and retain quality employees, including those with disabilities and veterans and foster youth and everything that makes Texas a great economy. Here again with us is Bonnie Downs. Bonnie, how are you?
I'm back. Again, you keep inviting me back, so I'm excited.
Big weekend.
It was a big weekend. We had F1 out at the Circuit of Americas, and it was a jam-packed weekend. We've been hosting F1, I think, since 2012, and it keeps growing bigger and bigger. The first race that was hosted estimated about 117,000 people. And last year, it attracted more than 432,000 people with a $7 billion in economic impact to Austin, Texas, providing Texans more than 64,000 jobs a year.
That's huge.
Which is crazy. It's equivalent to bringing a Super Bowl
to
Austin. So we are just so grateful to have that international connection in F1, at Circuit of Americas. And we want to keep that going and getting bigger and bigger every year, which it looks like it is. So.
The whole region feels it. I mean, it's just a buzz. Yeah. It's a buzz of everything. There was a huge football game on. It was a big weekend. Big week. We won't go into that.
We won't go into that one.
Longhorn friends. And also with us here is one of our attorneys, Jaku Johns. Jaku,
hello.
How are you?
Good, Commissioner. How are you doing?
Yeah, we're good. Good. So Jaku's one of the 4 employment law attorneys that we have. And they've helped me out so much getting through our process and educating me on employment. They're the stars of the show at our Texas Conference for Employers that we do all over the state. And today we're going to be talking about creating an effective policy handbook, which is huge for employers. So again, this is this is going to be a great episode. We're focusing on training employers. We're focusing on getting as much people to understand the unemployment insurance process, and we're very excited to continue to bring different topics scattered out and through this podcast. So Jaku, thank you. First of all, thank you for everything you do. You're such a joy to have in the office.
Oh, thank you, Commissioner. That means a lot.
Yes, and I used to work with Jaku as well.
I know, Bonnie. So good to see you back here.
Yes.
It's I've been with the agency for about 3 years now. And I had the opportunity to work with some amazing people and do some amazing work here. So just glad to be here doing this podcast, and hopefully in the future I can do a lot more and be of valuable contribution to this podcast.
Yeah. So on top of that, each of our attorneys also provides a topic for our newsletter that goes into detail, and it's usually summed up from the questions we're asked. But yeah, today we're going to be talking about our handbook policy. We've got a great resource with our guidebook for employers. But yeah, let's kick it off. Let's first of all, why should employers be worried about the quality of their own handbook?
Right. So as far as policies are concerned, one of the most important things that one of the most frequent questions that employers ask is it required?
Mm-hmm.
Is it required for an employer to have a policy handbook? And the answer to that question is there's no law which requires employers to have a policy handbook. But at the same time, will I ever recommend an employer to not have a handbook? Absolutely, 100% no. And the reason why that is the case, because having a good handbook, what it does, it acts like a sword, pretty much like a sword and a shield in a lawsuit. It helps the employer to justify the legality of their actions, and it provides the employer at the end of the day with an affirmative defense. If an employer, they have a well-written policy and they're enforcing that policy, then a lawsuit happens, then they have a good affirmative defense that they can make. Now, the second point that I want to make there is for an unemployment claim.
Mm-hmm.
So if an employer, they don't have a good handbook, if they don't have good policies, then what happens is good luck winning an unemployment claim. The reason why is, and I know Elsa talked about unemployment insurance in the last podcast, and I'm sure she's going to talk about this again when she's on air. But one thing, if you terminate an employee, what you have to show is misconduct connected with the work. Now, one of the elements for misconduct is that the claimant knew or should have known that they would be terminated for such reason. Now, without a policy, without a good handbook, how do as an employer, how do you prove that the employee knew what was required of them? What was the standards? It's going to be hard to do.
So when it comes to acknowledging an employer, or excuse me, an employee, they'll have you sign. Is it that you read it, that you agree upon it? How does that work?
Yeah, absolutely, Commissioner. So, to an extent, it is, right? So, it's important to not just have a policy. It's important that your employees acknowledge the policies that you have in place. Now, before that, the employer needs to make sure that they understand, right? So, what I tell employers is, when you're enforcing a policy, make sure you give your employees enough chance to read the policies. Have a meeting during work hours to let them know what the policy is about. And before the day is done, make sure you get an acknowledgement from them. If they have any questions, address those questions so they know at the end of the day that the employee is going to be bound to the terms and conditions of that policy, whatever it may be. So it's important to get that acknowledgement. A policy is not enough without an acknowledgement. If you don't have that acknowledgement, then it's completely useless.
And so going back to why should employers care? I mean, it really sounds like, this affects the bottom line, correct? It does come down to money. And if they don't have a policy handbook in place, then that's going to affect an unemployment claim. It's kind of like the building blocks starting to get everything in order. Is that correct?
Right, absolutely. And, like you mentioned, you hit the nail on the head there, Bonnie. If losing an unemployment claim, if you don't have policies and based on you not having effective policies or you not enforcing the policies well enough, and that leads to losing an unemployment claim, again, as Elsa mentioned last week, that could lead to your tax rates going up for the next 3 years, and that can be a significant amount. And on top of that, let's talk about lawsuits. That's thousands of dollars that you are spending litigating a case. And for small businesses, that can even be business shutting events. So employers have to be careful.
So it sounds like you're starting a business. Checkbox number 1, create a policy handbook.
Exactly. That's what I tell employers. The first thing that you do, definitely create a policy handbook and let your employees know what the expectations are. And one thing that I do want to mention is that we do have a guidebook, and I know Commissioner mentioned that we do have sample policies in that guidebook. So employers, it's a free resource for you guys out there. So if you have questions, call us, or we have the resources available for you.
Do you have any favorite questions that employers are calling in and wanting to ask? Anything you can share?
Yeah,
with us?
absolutely. One of the most frequent questions that we get in our office, Commissioner, concerns breaks. Are breaks required?
I take a lot of breaks.
I do too. Well, I shouldn't tell you, you're my boss. But the answer to that question is generally breaks are not required by the law.
Okay.
But employers, you guys really need to be concerned about that, because not providing reasonable breaks throughout the workday, what happens at that point is they can run into a lot of trouble. So, for example, there was an employer not too long ago. What the employer was doing was allowing employees, it was a chicken processing plant. What this employer was doing was having employees on the line wear adult diapers so they wouldn't have to go to the restroom. So things like that, employers, you guys, employers want to be careful and allow reasonable breaks during the workday. So something like
reasonable and logical.
Reasonable and logical, exactly. Once if employers are reasonable with their actions, there's less of a chance that they can run into problems down the line.
Very good. Yeah, no, that's great. What's the meat and potatoes of a policy of the handbook you're talking about?
Right. So
bare minimum. The
bare minimum. So that's a great question, Commissioner. So that kind of goes into policy formatting. So what employers need to do is, basic thing is you need to explain the rule. Say what you mean. And a lot of employers, you guys, they have policies on insubordination. Right, that's a common policy. Insubordination at the workplace is not permitted. Now, that being said, I can ask, you, Commissioner. I can ask you, Bonnie, what does insubordination mean? And, I can get two different definitions
big
for the same
definition.
thing. Exactly. So as an employer, what is required is that you explain the rule. And how do you do that? You do that through providing examples. You need to make it clear. As an employer, you cannot be hiding the ball from your employees. And finally, as far as formatting the meat and potatoes, as far as formatting consequences, the employer needs to make sure that in the policy itself, they let them know what the consequences are for the violation of the rule. If it's a zero tolerance policy, let your employees know that, a violation of this policy will lead to termination of employment. Or if it's a progressive disciplinary policy, let your employees know, maybe it's verbal, written, final termination, whatever it may be. That's for the employer to decide, but the employer needs to make sure that they communicate with the employee, and if they have any questions, then address that as well.
It sounds like you have to create the policy handbook and then reinforce. What happens if you do not reinforce?
That's a great question, Bonnie. Now, that's when the employer can lead to trouble. The issue is if you don't reinforce that policy. Now, at the end of the day, the claimant could come up, let's say, for an unemployment claim, and they can argue, I was never aware of this policy. Right? The employer had this policy, but they never communicated. Or the policy was so convoluted that they never communicated what they were expecting out of that policy. And like I mentioned before, in a discharge case in the context of unemployment, the employer has the burden to show misconduct. And it's going to be really, really, really hard for the employer to do that if they can show that, the policy was clear, the employee knew about that policy, and they still violated that policy.
Well, good. So ultimately, it's protection. Like state of Texas is a right to work state, and you're basically putting a roadmap on protecting your employee and protecting yourself as an employer. Correct?
Exactly. It prevents the employers from having possible liability that can come down the line. And at the same time, it provides a structure for the employees as well. They know what is that's expected out of them. It provides them at the end of the day with a structure. I was talking to Elsa the other day, and we were just chatting, and it's like parenting, right? At the end of the day, if you have two parents and you're telling a child two different stories on how to behave, then, that child is walking on magma, right? They don't know what your expectations are of them.
Yeah.
But if you ask the employer, if you are clear as far as what your standards are, what your expectations are, then it just makes your job much easier in having an effective workplace.
So it has to be applied evenly to everybody.
It has to be applied evenly, and that's a great point that you bring up, Commissioner. You can't have a sense of favoritism, right? So if you have set policies, then you pretty much avoid a sense of favoritism at the workplace, and that can avoid worst case scenario charge of discrimination or, like I mentioned before, favoritism at the workplace. And again, to sum it up, it really does not affect morale at the workplace, because if you do have favoritism, or you do exceptions to your policies, one after the other, then it creates that sense of favoritism and
moving the goalpost.
Exactly.
Chiku, I have a question. What are some items or some things that go into the handbook that employers are surprised to know that should be in there?
Right. So that's a great question, Bonnie. Now, one thing that I would say is one of the basic ones is vacation and sick leave, right? That's a set of policies that employers have a lot of questions on, and the reason why is vacation or sick leave is not required now. Generally not required. Now, the thing with sick leave is that unpaid sick leave, it can be required in the context of Family Medical Leave Act or the Americans with Disabilities Act. Now, and that's unpaid leave. Paid leave is not required. Now, the same thing with vacation leave. Vacation leave, paid or unpaid, is not required. But that being said, If an employer has a policy on it, or if they have a past precedent which dictates that you, as the employer, you will be providing for vacation time or sick time, then per the Texas payday law, you're going to be bound to the terms and conditions of that policy or that past practice. Now, in the same question, employers sometimes ask us, is it okay to implement English only policies at the workplace? Now, the answer to that question is yes, you can, but employers need to be very, very, very careful. And if you are implementing such a policy, you need to have a good business necessity for having such a policy. Without that, that kind of a policy, and the EEOC and the courts have found that that kind of a policy is not going to fly. So those are some things that employers need to be careful about. The employers, like a vacation and sick leave, you could have such a policy, but just be aware of those mindfuls.
So I'm starting a business out of my garage as landscaping. I've got a mower that I haven't used all that much, so I'm going to start running out there, and I start hiring other people in the area. So can I call Jakku, and can you write my handbook?
That's a great question, Commissioner. Although I cannot write your handbook for you, what I can do is I can tell you, call that 800 number.
Okay.
The 800-832-9394 number. Now, once you do call that number, we have attorneys on staff. So Tommy, Elsa, me, or Mario, we will definitely help you and let you know what are the pitfalls that you should be looking for, right? What is a good way of going about it? That we can do. We are just not authorized to write your handbook for you, but what we can do is provide great information about what you should be on the lookout for. And I think I mentioned earlier, our guidebook is a great resource because we do have sample policies in there. So take a look at that as well, and that's great information for the employer to use.
Awesome. So the topics that Jakku you brought up, that it's not we've exhausted a lot of the as far as the issues that may come up, but it's in no means the limit of what you should or you want to consider putting in your handbook, correct? So again, like I said, our attorneys are very helpful. You guys are doing a great job. So bottom line is, the topics that we discussed are no way exhausted, right? There's some you should consider. Call our attorneys. Call the 1-800 number and get with any of our 4 attorneys are great customer service. They'll help you through it. But bottom line is you need a policy handbook for your employers.
Absolutely.
If you're an employer,
the employer is in a much better shape if they do have a policy handbook than if they don't, and they're just going off of one set of policies or rules one day versus the other. So it's always better to have a good, well-written policy handbook, and more than that, as an employer, you enforce that handbook.
Awesome. Jakku, thank you so much.
Thank
Bonnie,
you,
did we leave anything out?
No, I think we covered it all. Sounds like we just need a handbook.
Good. Well, yeah, get a handbook, everybody. Call us. We'll help. But thank you, Jakku, for coming on and walking us through the handbook policy.
It's an absolute privilege to be here.
But everybody, thank y'all for another week of available work, for listening in, and continue to stay up to date on topics with our employer's office. Thanks, folks.